Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak, and welcome to the 9th video in our series where we are building a small rowing and sailing boat out of skin-on frame construction. Now, if this is your first time with this series, make sure that at the least you go back to episode 5, because that's when we reset this project from building a larger rowing and sailing dinghy to this smaller St. Lawrence River skiff. In that episode, I talk all about what the St. Lawrence River skiff is and where it came from and why we chose it for this particular design project. And if you want an even deeper background on this project, go all the way back and watch the introduction to episode number 1, because that's where I talk about my own history building larger boats out of skin-on frame construction. I talk about what went right and what went wrong and what we're hoping to accomplish in the future. Finally here, if this is your first time on the channel, once again, my name is Brian. I've been building skin-on frame boats for over 20 years. I offer online video courses and plan sets for how to build skin-on frame kayaks and canoes. All right, so diving right in here, we just finished our first major on-the-water test of the St. Lawrence River skiff. We loaded it down with enough weight to simulate a week-long camping trip, and then we spent 2 days paddling, pedaling, and sailing up the Columbia River Gorge, basically against the current, but with the wind. Overall, it was a great trip. We had lots of fun. We definitely had some issues and some failures on the boat, but that's just all part of the design process. And I'm going to tell you all about that, but not in this episode, because it's going to take me at least a week to upload and edit all of that footage so I can share it with you. So instead, for this episode, what I want you to do is just walk you through the whole process of getting this boat set up for that sort of a trip. I'm going to show you our flotation strategy and all the safety gear that we brought with us. I'm going to talk about what we wear when we're out on the water. We're going to go through every piece of camping gear that we brought with us and how we packed it into the boat. And then finally, I'm going to talk about each of the 5 different kinds of propulsion that we could use in this particular St. Lawrence River skiff. So even if you're not planning on building or camping out of a St. Lawrence River skiff, there should be a lot of great information here, and I think you're going to learn a lot about small boat safety and small boat camping in general. All right, let's get into this. So starting out with flotation, what you're looking at here is 2 air inflatable fenders. These are commonly sold as beach rollers, but they're basically just repurposed inflatable fenders. And the reason I like these is because they've got a bunch of flotation. They're about the right size for a lot of small boat applications, and they're made out of really tough fabric. So if I accidentally brush it with a knife or a fishing hook, I'm not going to end up without flotation. And the specific dimensions on these are 9 inches wide, and they come 5 feet long, which is usually pretty good, but for this particular boat it didn't work out very well because this space here is a little bit shorter than that between the seats. So I actually had to modify these by cutting them in half and then gluing them back together with a PVC patch. It was a huge pain. It's not recommended. I recently ordered another float from a different manufacturer that actually should fit in here, and I'm hoping that those end up working out, because I wouldn't expect people to do this just to be able to get flotation in their boat. So anyways, the reason that I like to set up this way with a big float on either side in the middle of the canoe is because if I'm heading out into water where I'm going to be farther away from shore than I can comfortably swim with the boat, meaning dragging the boat full of water back to shore, I want to make sure that if the boat ends up flooded with water, it's still sitting upright and it's controllable and maneuverable. And the only way that I've found to do that is to have a decent amount of flotation up high on either side of the boat and a little bit of flotation in either end, which I'll show you here in a minute. And so you can see here that right now I've got this tied in with a couple cam straps. This is not a permanent solution because once it just takes a little bit too long to set it up this way. And also you've only got 2 points of support, which means if one of these springs a leak, this thing could crawl up and out of there and then you would have a problem. So ultimately what's going to happen when I find some time is I'm going to sew some 1.5 inch wide webbing loops with the big buckles that they use for backpacks here, here, and here. And that way when I'm setting up the boat, it's just fast and easy. I just take the float, throw it in here, click, 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 I've got my flotation. Now, just a quick side note, whatever type of flotation you have in a small boat, you want to make sure that you can always reach the inflation valves while you're on the water. So if this thing starts to overheat, you can let a little bit of air out, or if you need to top it off, you can put a little bit of air in. And this was especially important on our trip because this bag still has a little bit of a leak, and so every 20 minutes or so, Liz had to give it a couple pumps just to make sure it was topped off. Now, coming to the end of the boat, I wasn't really concerned about end flotation on this particular trip, just because the dry bags that we use to put our gear in are watertight themselves, and in this particular configuration, the gear bags go towards the ends of the boat, so I knew I could count on those to provide sufficient end buoyancy. But if that wasn't the case, or if we were going on a more serious trip in rougher, more open water, I would definitely have bigger end flotation than what you see right here. This is just a kayak paddle float that I stuffed in here at the last moment and tied down. Not the ideal solution, but it worked for this particular trip. Now, moving on to other accessories, obviously if you're going to have floats, you're going to need some sort of a pump. So I've got my K-Pump Mini here, and that usually just lives right here, tucked under this strap. And then coming to the opposite side of the boat towards the back of the float, you can see I've got this Bexon bilge pump tucked right here. This is just a standard kayak size bilge pump. It has the float collar, so if you lose it overboard, it doesn't sink. And this is not for getting the majority of the water out of a swamped boat. This is just for getting the last couple inches out of the bottom where you can't effectively bail. Now, for quickly bailing water out of a fully flooded small boat, I'm a big fan of the old school bleach bottle bailer here. It's basically just this style of jug. You cut it out so you've got a big opening that you can scoop with, and you've still got a handle that you can grab. And these are really useful, but it is important to keep in mind what this will and will not accomplish. If you've got relatively calm water and you can bail like crazy, you can empty a boat like this in about 5 minutes or a little bit less if you've got 2 people working with these. But if you're out in rough water and you're taking waves over the side, there is no way you're going to be able to keep up with something like this. In that condition, the only thing that's going to save you is something like a 5-gallon bucket. Now, one of the important things about this is just talking about how I attach this to the boat, because it's tempting to start tying lanyards onto things so you don't accidentally lose them. But if you tie a lanyard onto every single thing you don't want to lose in the bottom of a small boat, you're going to create a massive entanglement hazard, and it's just going to make it difficult to actually use those things. And so there's a certain amount of risk that you have to take to have some things be at least semi-loose in the bottom of the boat. And in this case, the way that I like to do it is I have a ball bungee right here. This is just a little bungee cord with a plastic ball on it. These are commonly used for tying down tarps. And what I'll do is I'll just tuck this behind one of these float straps like this. And that is pretty darn secure. That's not going anywhere. But at the same time, if I'm in an emergency situation, I can grab this and just yank on it, and it's going to pop out, and then I can get to work bailing it out. And honestly, I usually carry 2 of these in the boat. That way, if we're swamped, both people can bail. I've got one tucked right here, and then I've got another one tucked under the strap in the back. Now, before we move on here, I want to show you a little closer view of this ball bungee that I was talking about earlier. Once again, these are commonly sold as tarp tie downs. It's a little bungee cord. It's got a plastic ball on the end of it. And the way it works is you can just wrap it around any surface and put the loop back around itself. And it's a great way to hold things inside of a boat without having to tie a bunch of little ropes or have a bunch of lanyards. So I've usually got a whole bunch of these on hand in a couple different sizes. These are a little bit longer, these are a little bit shorter. Now, coming back to the bow of the boat, you can see I've got a rope here. It's always a good idea to have a rope, so if you stop somewhere, you can tie your boat off so it doesn't end up floating away if the tide comes up. And this particular rope happens to be the rope from my Salamander tow belt that I've had literally for, I think, 20 years now. It's about 60 feet of a 1/4-inch polyester rope. Sometimes this is actually a little bit too short when I'm landing on a beach and I want to tie to a tree or a log, but honestly, I think it would really annoy me if it was any longer than it is. So I like to put this on here by tying a huge loop around something in the bow. And in this case, I've got this handle. So I'm going to tie a gigantic bowline here. just like this. And usually I tie a mountaineer's bowline just to make sure that's not going to come undone. And the reason I just tied this on with this giant loop is because I've found through experience that sometimes you find yourself out of your boat needing to swim the boat to shore. And it's actually not very efficient to swim when you've got one hand grabbing the boat or one hand grabbing a rope. And so if you've got this loop right here, you can actually loop this through your shoulder, and then you've got both hands you can swim, and the boat is just sitting right here up against the side of you, and it's just a little bit quicker to move the boat through the water if you find yourself in that situation. And this here is another opportunity to make use of a ball bungee. I usually just put this right here like this, and then I'll wrap a ball bungee behind it like that. And that's pretty secure, but in an emergency, if I need to grab this whole thing, I could just grab it and it's going to come right out. All right, so before we go any further, why don't we just cover the bottom of the boat here? This isn't as necessary in a boat that's nailed together like this one here, but if you're building a canoe that's lashed together, you want to protect those lashings. Now, if you're going to be kneeling in the bottom of your boat, let's say you're building a canoe, in that case, I would recommend using a Thermarest Ridge Rest mat. They're not very expensive and they are surprisingly comfortable to kneel on, even if you don't have floorboards underneath. Now, in this case, I'm doing something a little bit different because I found if I need to cut out the center of a ridge rest for this drive box, it tends to tear at the corners and deteriorate pretty quickly. And also, it's a little bit bulky, and when I'm headed down to Mexico in my Jeep, every bit of space matters. So this time, I'm using a yoga mat with the center cut out of it like this. And it's just the perfect size to protect anywhere that we're going to be putting our feet. See, it fits down in here real nice. And if you're wondering why I don't use floorboards in the bottom of my boats, it's because with my particular rib and stringer geometry, those are just close enough together that usually you can step anywhere and not be stepping directly on the skin. And floorboards are pretty darn heavy, and so if I don't have to have them, I'd rather not add the extra weight. All right, so next essential item is going to be a day bag slash ditch bag. And this is where I'm going to be putting everything that I might need access to on the water that doesn't already fit inside of my PFD. So I'm going to have extra food in here. I'm going to have extra clothes, possibly some navigation equipment, communication gear, signaling devices. And if there is any possibility whatsoever that I may end up losing my boat and have to swim to shore with nothing but this, I want to make sure that I've got fire making supplies, I've got an emergency tarp, and at the very least, a very big, warm, puffy coat that is going to keep me warm or at least survivable throughout one night or 2 nights. And this particular bag happens to be a watershed dry duffel, and I have a love-hate relationship with this bag. I love it because it is incredibly tough and completely waterproof. I actually got the one with the inflation valve on it so I can turn this into its own float. But the thing I don't like about it is it's actually kind of a pain to use. I've got 4 buckles that I've got to pop to get into this here. And then I got to pull really hard on this giant Ziploc seal. And then once I've gotten whatever I need out of it, I've got to reverse this whole process. And so honestly, oftentimes when I'm out on the water, I just do something a lot simpler. I've got a 20-liter regular dry bag, and then whenever I close it up, I just make sure I roll it up really well. That way it's not going to leak water on me, and I find that that's a little bit easier to use. Now, I just mentioned my PFD a couple of moments ago, so why don't we take a second just to go through everything that I like to wear when I'm out on the water. Keep in mind, this is just going to be a super quick overview. If I go into detail about why I like these particular products, this is going to be its own 20-minute long video, which I might end up making at some point. So, starting out with the PFD here, this is the Kokatat Misfit Tour. This was recently discontinued and replaced with something else. I haven't tried that product yet, but I would trust that it is at least as good as this PFD, if not better. Now, for footwear, I like these NRS Kinetic water shoes. These are really low profile, flexible water shoes. I personally find them to be a lot more comfortable than wearing a bulky water shoe inside of a kayak, and they're much more comfortable if you're kneeling in a canoe. Now, for what I'm wearing on my lower body, usually I just get the cheapest possible quick dry pants I can find. Sometimes it's just something I pick up for $5 at a secondhand store. I've never seen a good reason to spend a lot of money on quick dry pants. However, on the other hand, when it comes to a good sun shirt, that's where I'm willing to invest. And unfortunately, my favorite sun shirt is no longer being produced. This is the old style Kokatat paddling shirt. Sometimes you can still find these on eBay, and if you can pick one of these up, it is a great investment. Once again, this has a ton of awesome features, but I'm not going to go into that detail. Now, also, I've got some type of a sun hat and either a backup sun hat or at the very least a bandana, because it's pretty easy to lose your hat, and if you don't have a way to protect your head and your face, that sunburn is going to really suck the happiness out of your trip. Now, as far as general wind and rain protection, if this is just a warm weather trip, say something in the late spring, early summer, early fall, generally I'm just bringing along some type of a splash top. This happens to be kind of a fancy paddler's top here. It doesn't really seal at the wrists or the neck, so it's not something you'd want to roll a kayak in, but just to keep you out of the wind and out of a little bit of rain, this is really all you need. And if you don't feel like spending the money, a cheap rain slicker is going to do exactly the same thing. Now, on the other hand, if I do think I'm going to be getting into some seriously cold or inclement weather, and especially if I think there's a possibility that I could end up in very cold water, now I'm going straight to my Kokatat Gore-Tex dry suit. And when it comes to immersion protection or really cold weather paddling, I don't like anything between what I just showed you and a really good dry suit, because what I've seen over the years is that as people are kind of ramping up to get into more cold weather paddling, they start working their way slowly through neoprene layers and splash tops and then dry suit drops and then cheap dry suits that don't breathe, and ultimately everybody ends up at the same place with an expensive Gore-Tex dry suit. So what I'm going to recommend is, if you think you might be going that direction with your paddling, just spend the money in the beginning and get the nice Gore-Tex dry suit, because it's going to save you money in the long run, and these are super comfy to wear. So I just want to jump in here really quick and mention that we are a Kokatat dealer. We do stock some Kokatat products on our website, but I've decided not to stock any of the dry suits just because there are so many different options, and I would rather work with each person individually to make sure they're getting the options that they actually need and not paying for anything that they don't need. So it just makes more sense to do it as a custom order on an individual basis. So if you're interested in a new dry suit, feel free to drop me a line. Happy to talk you through all the different options. It's a great way to support what we do here, and also I am happy to price match with other dealers. Now, coming back around to the front of the Canoe, I've gone ahead and put together all the equipment that I normally bring with me on a week-long camping trip. Once again, I'm not going to go into a deep level of detail. I'm just going to tell you what's in these bags as we load them into this 107-liter NRS Outfitter bag. Now, if you're an ultralight backpacker, you could probably get away with their 60-liter bags, but I think most people that are just camping medium light, a bag like this is going to be more appropriately sized if you're just using a one-bag system. So, before I get into this here, I want you to notice that some of these items are in their own separate dry bags, and that is because on any river trip or trip on the water, if you need something to stay dry, it needs to be double dry bagged. So the foundation of my system is almost exclusively these 13-liter lightweight Sea to Summit bags, and then I put these inside of the bigger dry bag. So this dry bag here has my sleeping bag in it. We're gonna go ahead and put it in. And then this dry bag right here has my big puffy down coat in it. I'm gonna put that in. And then this is my sleeping mat. It doesn't need to stay dry, so it's not in a dry bag. And then here I've got a tent. It also doesn't absolutely have to stay dry, so it's not in a dry bag. And then down here, I've just got all of my spare clothes for the week. And just a good tip, if you haven't done a lot of extended camping, you can usually get away with a lot less changes of clothes than you think that you can. I mean, everybody's got different bodies, and I'm not going to tell you to bring less underwear or whatever, but you'd be surprised at how little clothes you can get away with. You just want to make sure that you do have those extra layers in case something gets wet or you end up having a really cold night. So I also generally have a little bit of entertainment stuff in here as well, like a Kindle and a deck of cards. And then in this bag here, I've got my stove, my cook kit, I've got a fuel bottle, and I've got my coffee cup. And then I've got my hiking sandals. Honestly, I usually just bring flip-flops, but I think more people would usually be using something like this. And then finally, we've got food. And for a week-long trip, I'm usually bringing a couple bags of food, and I usually plan for 2 pounds of food per person per day. So if it was just me on this trip, and this was a 7-day trip, both these bags would total about 14 pounds of weight. So let's go ahead and close this up. You always want to take the flap on top and fold that over first. And then some of these have different closures. This one happens to have 2 strips that are meant to be folded in half. And then after that, you want to roll this carefully 3 times at least. And then I'm going to clip the buckle on the top. I'm going to clip the buckles on the sides. And once again, I've packed this fairly loosely and full of air, because if you pack it loosely like this, not only is it less likely to suck water in the event of a capsize or a swamping, but this also just adds to the overall flotation of your canoe. And total, this thing with the food in it as well weighs about 36 pounds. Basically, my base kit weighs about 21 pounds and the food is gonna weigh another 14 or 15 pounds. And that is everything that I need for a week when I'm out on the water. So I'm just gonna load this into the boat right in front of the front seat. You can see there's plenty of room here for this big bag. And then I'll usually take a strap and strap this in place. Now, coming around to the back of the canoe at the other end of the boat, there is technically room to put another one of these 107-liter dry bags, but considering that so many of the items that went into the front bag are shared items, usually you can get away with a bit smaller 60-liter bag in the back here. So you can see that fits in there real nice. Plenty of room back here. And again, we're going to go ahead and strap this down. So this gives us gear and also flotation at both ends of the canoe. Now, before we go any further here, I just want to point out real quick that this particular packing strategy with the gear at the ends of the boat only applies to this particular boat that has the seats closer to the middle and this pedal drive box right here. If I was doing this in a canoe where the paddlers are sitting closer to the ends, I'd want to concentrate that gear weight as much as possible in the center of the canoe. Okay, so just a couple more items we need to cover here. As far as what we do for water, it really depends on the situation. If we're out somewhere where I know I have constant access to water, or even the water that we're in is clean enough to drink, all I bring with me is one of those Sawyer 32-ounce squeeze water filtration bags. That's about the lightest and most simple solution. On the other hand, if you're somewhere where you're not going to be able to get water, for example, the first 5 days of a trip on the Green River, there is no water. In that case, you're going to need to bring a bunch of it. And generally what I'm using is these 10-liter MSR dromedary bags. They carry a ton of water in a very compact space, and you can pack them really low in the boat, and that's going to really increase your stability. So for 2 people on a Green River trip, generally I'm carrying 4 of these as full as I can get them. These ones I'm actually going to retire here pretty soon because they're of the older generation that kind of taste like poison. I'm not sure if there was a recall on these or not, but they taste like they are actively giving you cancer. So I think these are going to become permanent water ballast bags, and I'm going to see if I can replace them with the newer ones, which hopefully taste a bit less like chemicals. Now, last general item here, and this just applies to me, this is my photography and filming gear. This is a Pelican case. It is packed full of lithium batteries and GoPros and memory cards and just all kinds of the widgets that we use to make the movie magic happen when we're out on the water. So this weighs about 10 pounds. For you, this might be something different. Maybe this is your fishing gear or your photography stuff or, you know, whatever thing you're into. Now, one last thing I want to mention before we start talking about propulsion is this really simple canoe cart that I built. Now, if you've ever seen a standard canoe cart, it's usually a lot narrower than this and it sits higher up off the ground. And those things are actually really good for what they're designed for, which is portaging on narrow trails. But it's actually kind of a pain to get a canoe up on top of them. And for me, by the time I've wrestled a heavy boat on top of one of those carts, I've already put the strain on my back that I was trying to avoid in the first place. And so what I decided to do for this particular boat was just buy a couple 16-inch wheels off the internet. I've got an aluminum axle, and then I encapsulated that axle in some wood here just to make it a little bit stiffer. And then I've got a couple of strap eyes at either end. And the way this works is I can just put this underneath the boat, and when I pull up to shore, I can just literally just keep pulling the boat with the stern of the boat still floating in the water. So it's very easy to pull it up onto this cart, and then I can strap down to these eyes, and then it just makes it super easy to pull this up the beach. I mean, you definitely want to take your big heavy gear bags and your water bags out first. But without that in there, I think this thing works fantastic. It would be a nightmare if you were trying to portage this on narrow trails. But for what I'm using it for, this is a great solution. It actually ends up being a little bit lighter than a standard canoe cart. Now, just a quick clarification, this is only going to work well with this style of boat that is based off of laminated frames. Because if you try to do this in one of my canoes that just has bent frames throughout, this is going to put way too much of a point load right along the center of the boat. And in that case, you would be better served with a normal canoe cart that's going to spread that load a little bit more. These wheels come off really easy. And then I can just tuck this stuff out of the way wherever it happens to fit in the boat, making sure that I remember to run a strap through these wheels so they don't float away if we end up tipping over. All right, so that's pretty much everything that we need to head out on our trip. The only thing we haven't talked about so far is propulsion. And I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this boat is kind of unique because there are 5 different ways that you can make this move through the water. So why don't we just go through those one by one. So starting out with oars. Oars are going to be the traditional way that you would move a St. Lawrence River skiff. These oars are fairly short. They're only about 7.5 feet long. Generally, they're pinned oars, but you could do it any way you wanted to. I've just got this particular boat set up with one rowing station to be used as a tandem, but if I didn't have the pedal drive and all the other options in here, I could also have a center seat and set it up for rowing solo as well. So that's the first option. Now, the next option is just regular old canoe paddles. Keep in mind, a St. Lawrence River skiff doesn't have optimal width or optimal seating locations to get a really good clean canoe stroke, but it does work, and especially in tight spaces where you can't row the boat, it's really nice to have some canoe paddles along for the ride to act as auxiliary propulsion. And we normally just tuck these one on either side underneath the strap on top of the float. That way this isn't going anywhere, but if you need to grab it really quick, super quick and easy to grab. Next up, we've got this box in the middle of the canoe, and what this is an adapter for the Hobie Mirage Drive. Now, I don't expect that a lot of people are going to take the time to put this into their own St. Lawrence River skiff because this is actually a fair amount of work to make this modification, and also these drives are extremely expensive. But if you're someone like me with mobility issues, or if you're someone that could really use one of these because you love to fish and you want to have your hands free, or maybe you're a photographer or a hunter, in that case, it might be worth the investment. And this drive here just drops in like this. Then you can use your feet to make the boat go forward. Now, in addition to the Hobie Mirage Drive, this adapter box also has other accessories that'll fit into it. And specifically what I'm talking about here is an electric motor adapter. Now, this particular electric motor is something I bought, 3 or 4 years ago now. This is the Bixby electric motor. It's one of their first generations, and I haven't had a chance to try their newer generation motor, so I'm not sure if I would want one of those or not. To do it again, I might not buy this same type of motor. And when I tend to think about little motors like this, I tend to think of them more as auxiliary propulsion and not primary propulsion, because usually they don't have a battery pack that lasts long enough to use this for a whole day on the water. The battery pack for this particular boat is going to move this at about 2 miles per hour for about 5 hours, or 3 miles per hour for about 3 hours, or 4 miles per hour for about an hour and a half. It's not a very big battery. So if I was to build an electric motor system again, I would probably build the entire thing myself and start with a 60 amp hour battery, lithium, and then figure out what motor options I could potentially adapt. And that might give me something with a little bit more range. All right, so now let's talk about sails. And I apologize for the view on this. I will try to throw in some clips of this out on the water just so you can see this better. But what you're looking at here is a 35 square foot lug sail with spars, the mast, and the mast partner. And altogether, all of this ends up weighing about 20 pounds. And it is fairly bulky, even though it is not that big of a sail. And some people might look at this and think that this sail is a little bit small for this size of boat, but it's important to keep in mind that skin boats are generally quite a bit lighter than other boats of similar dimensions, so you don't need quite as much sail area to push them. And if you over canvas a skin boat, it can get twitchy and even start to get kind of dangerous. So I feel like for just sort of general medium performance for this size of boat, this sail is pretty darn appropriate. Now, if you wanted to kick up the performance on this even more, you could potentially add lee boards or even retrofit a dagger board into the pedal drive slot. But personally, I don't think I'm going to do that, because when it comes to upwind performance, I feel like if you're going to do it at all, you might as well go all the way. Because if you just kind of half-ass your lee boards or your dagger board and your sail geometry, what you generally end up with is a boat that is tacking, but it's not really tacking that high into the wind, in which case it makes more sense just to drop the sail and row or pedal straight into the wind. And there comes a point at which you're just investing a heck of a lot of time into all those gewgaws and gadgets and a lot of expense as well to not really get that good a performance. Or if you don't mind going all the way with it and you make perfectly carved foils and get the sail balance perfect and you do get this thing going upwind beautifully, well, in that case, you're still in a fairly narrow, fairly low volume boat, which means that it is going to be fairly limited in the conditions you can actually use it in. So for my money, I feel like the best value is just in a simple reaching and running rig like this one here. This rig will carry this thing beam to the wind just fine without any additional lee boards or dagger boards. And this is really all the stuff that I feel comfortable having in the canoe, especially if I'm taking it out on a camping trip. And honestly, if I was going to take this on a camping trip, I would have to be pretty darn certain that I was going to have favorable conditions that could really take advantage of this setup to justify having all this extra crap inside the boat. However, this is not the only sailing option. So let's just go ahead and pull this out. And we're going to grab this smaller sail, which is just our standard small pop-up sail that we have as part of our skin-on-frame canoe building course. And the way that this works in our skin-on-frame canoes is it's designed to be mounted all the way up at the bow, and it hinges off of the stem, and then as it pops up, the mast is actually captured between the ends of the gunnels. And this is pretty much exclusively a running sail, although on our very shortest pack canoes it actually reaches pretty well as well. And the whole idea behind this was to make it dead simple and as safe as possible, something that you're not necessarily planning to use all the time, but if you get a good wind that's blowing in the right direction, you can pop it up and you can sail and you can save your arms or your legs or whatever else you're moving the boat with. And to use this with this particular boat, what I did was I just made a quick and dirty mast partner. This just happened to be some 3/4 inch plywood that was sitting on the porch. I grabbed a big block of wood and screwed it onto it in the middle, and then I drilled a 3/4 inch hole. And then it's attached out here at the sides with the same attachment bolts that I use for the larger sail system. And the way that this works is you just go ahead and drop the mast into the hole, unfurl the sail, and then you could sail downwind, and you can actually sail onto a broad reach as well, although you definitely can't point any higher than that. So this is just an itty bitty little sail. It's nothing fancy. It is definitely undersized for this particular boat. But what I like about it is that it weighs 2 pounds instead of weighing 20 pounds, and it's super compact. This thing just tucks out of the way up here by my canoe cart. I don't even notice it, which is very different than if I'm carrying that larger sail on board. Also, you would be surprised at how much propulsion a little sail like this will give you. I'll talk about this more when we actually get to the video where I talk about the trip, but we spent an entire day sailing downwind in really mild winds, only about 12 miles per hour, and this sail was still pushing us as fast as we would have been able to pedal or row. So there's a lot of benefit to this tiny little sail right here. All right, guys, so I think I'm going to go ahead and call it here for this video. I was going to talk about the flood test that we did at the beginning of the trip that we just went on, but I think this video is probably way too long already, and it just makes more sense to talk about that when I talk about the rest of the trip, which is going to be the next episode in this series. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Also, just a couple final thoughts. First, I want to apologize for continuing to call this a canoe throughout this video. This is a St. Lawrence River skiff. It is somewhat similar to a canoe, but it is also quite different. Also, obviously, this camping strategy is going to change a little bit just depending on circumstances. For example, if you're traveling in bear country, obviously you want to be traveling with a bear canister and not just having your food in plastic bags. And then finally, if you have any of your own tips for camping out of small boats, please leave those in the comments below so other people, including me, can learn from your experience. I've been camping out of small boats for probably about 30 years now, and there is always more to learn, and I'm always interested in learning new things. So make sure you tell me what you know in the comments, and as usual, if you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. And then if you're interested in this skin-on-frame boat or any of our other skin-on-frame boats, make sure you check out our website, CapeFalconKayaks.com, where we have skin-on-frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on-frame resources. You can also find us on Instagram at CapeFalconBuilds, where we post photos and videos of whatever we're working on in the shop or whatever we're testing out on the water, and you can find that same content on the Cape Falcon Kayak Facebook page as well. So that's it for now. Take care, be safe on the water. I will see you next time.